I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, as I present to you the main segments of the literature review chapter. This section is meant for the students that I'm teaching at undergraduate and master's degree levels. Thank you so much for listening in, but one thing which I need to point out is that the section may be useful even for people who are pursuing degrees in other countries, and those who are doing PhDs, and even those who are writing research papers. You may listen in. The aim of this presentation is not to present information in a dogmatic way, but is to just provide guidance, which may assist scholars who are up and coming, and even scholars who are seasoned, to think in a more logical manner, in a more logical way, when they are crafting their literature review chapter. So without much wasting of time, I'm going to present the material that I've compiled for this purpose. So the aim of this installment of notes or lectures is to present to you the main segments of a typical literature review chapter. And this presentation is in two parts. There's the introductory part, which is what I'm presenting now, and the concluding part, which I'm going to present earlier on and make live later in the evening. The literature review chapter starts with an introduction, and it is typically the second chapter in a research project, with the first chapter being the introductory chapter or the background and introduction. It has got various names depending on different institutions and different lecturers or different departments and the different faculties. So the names of chapters are not cast on stone. So basically at the introduction, which is your 2.0, if you look at the naming of the segments, it conforms to the chapter in which the segment is appearing. Because we are in chapter 2, that's why all the segments are prefixed with the figure 2. So 2.0 is the origin of this chapter, which is the introduction. The aim of the introduction is to introduce the chapter by capturing the key segments or issues tackled in the chapter. The segment may be one or two paragraphs, but is usually one brief paragraph. Under normal circumstances, authors are not cited at this stage, as the purpose of the segment is to introduce the whole chapter or to introduce the main concepts that are grappled with during the course of the chapter. This section must never be written either in past tense or in future tense. It must always be written in present tense. This chapter tackles, not this chapter tackled. This chapter tackles, this chapter covers, this chapter explores, this chapter analyzes. Also evaluated in this chapter, it's in present tense or present continuous tense. Issues are not supposed to be discussed in this section of the literature review chapter. And then next we move on to the definition of key terms or the definition of key concepts. As the chapter heading or title indicates the aim of this segment is to define the key concepts. The research or researcher explores key definitions of key concepts from the perspectives of different authors or from the perspective of different scholars or authors. It is not advisable to rely on only one definition of a concept or term, as such a definition may be biased or might be biased. It is also not advisable to rely on many definitions of a term or terms from a single author. That author may have been biased in their selection of definitions to include in their write-up. I'm going to correct that, to include in their write-up. And then points to note in defining key terms. If the definitions are too long, the reviewer must paraphrase or summarize the definition. If the definitions are either too short or too shallow or both, then the researcher must rely on more than two definitions of terms or concepts. It may be necessary for the researcher to explain the variables captured by the definition or definitions. If the definitions involve the use of mathematical formulae or symbols, then the researcher must simplify the definition or definition. Symbols or complicated mathematical formulae must only be presented after explaining the conceptual framework of the study, not when one is defining key terms. Number 4, definitions of key terms and concepts must be analytical and not narrative or purely descriptive. We don't want any narration in this chapter or any description like someone is doing a blog or is just describing things, how things take place. We want a student who is analytical or a writer who is analytical. Definitions of key terms must conform to rules of logic. The researcher either moves from the simplest definition to the most complex, or from the most complex to the simplest definition. The review must never define concepts haphazardly or random. The review or the reviewer. And then concepts are best tackled according to the order in which they appear or are captured by items. I'm going to correct that. Are captured by items such as the research topic, background to the study, statement of the problem, research objectives, and research questions. Definitions of key terms must not delve into discussions or controversies. As such material is better grappled with or tackled under relevant sections, such as the detailed conceptual or theoretical framework of the study. Definitions of key terms must never be the main part of the literature review chapter. It's unacceptable for one to have a literature review chapter which comprises solely of definitions, or half of it is just definitions. And then the other half is the conceptual framework, the theoretical framework, and empirical literature review, as well as focused literature review and the chapter summary. That's not a literature review chapter. It will be something else. Now we move on to the conceptual framework, which is the last section that I'm going to cover in this introduction. The conceptual framework, a conceptual framework demonstrates clearly what you expect to find through your research or study. A conceptual framework is a written or visual representation of an expected relationship between variables, your key variables. Variables are simply the characteristics, qualities, or properties that you want to study. The conceptual framework is generally developed based on a literature review of existing studies and theories about the topic. The relevant variables for your study are clearly defined. It's very imperative that the study is delimited properly in terms of key variables or relevant variables. This section goes beyond mere definitions by mapping out how the main variables or concepts of a study might relate to each other. The construction of a conceptual framework precedes data collection, the gathering effort or the fieldwork phase of a study. It's generally not advisable to go and gather data out there in the field before one actually comes up with a very clear conceptual framework. The conceptual framework is often represented in a visual format, such as a graph, flowchart, or a diagram, with relationships either shown by arrows or nodes or other symbols. In the conceptual framework, simple conceptual framework that I develop here, I show relationships using boxes and arrows to simplify things. The conceptual framework, assuming an experimental design, is shown as follows. A conceptual framework can be designed in many different ways. The formulas text will depend on what kinds of relationships you expect to find. In the conceptual framework that I created or that I crafted for illustrative purposes, I'm assuming an experimental research design. So when we are looking at a conceptual framework, it's important to identify independent and dependent variables. If one wants to test or analyze a cause and effect relationship, one needs to identify at least two key variables. At least two. There may be more than that. That's what it means. There may be more than two. The independent variable and the dependent variable. In our example, the expected cause, interest rate, commercial bank prime lending rates, is the independent variable, also known as the predictor or explanatory variable. The expected effect, which is gross fixed capital formation or gross investment, is the dependent variable, also known as the response or outcome variable. In other words, gross investment depends on interest rates. Our hypothesis is that the lower the interest rate, the higher will be the level of gross investment in an economy and vice versa, all other things being constant. That's what that ceteris paribus assumption or that Latin statement means. It means all other things being equal or all other things being constant. So causal relationships often involve several independent variables, such as the interest rate, the inflation rate, the economic growth rate, the index of manufacturing, monthly rainfall figures or statistics, and so on, that affect the dependent variable, which is your gross investment. However, to keep things simple, we will assume only the interest rate as the independent variable. Now, to visualize our expected cause and effect relationship, one may use this combination of two boxes and one arrow. With the first box identifying the interest rate, which is the cause, of gross investment, which is the effect. The next step may involve the identification of other variables that may influence the relationship between our independent interest rate and dependent variable gross investment. Some common variables to include are moderators, mediators, and control variables. Now we will expand the framework by adding a moderating variable, also known as a moderator. A moderator alters the effect that an independent variable has on a dependent variable. Most independent variables, they act through a transmission mechanism. So if you have interest rates, they will go through a transmission mechanism to disseminate their effect on the dependent variable, which is your gross investment. So this transmission mechanism will be having a series of moderating variables or moderators. A complete conceptual framework must thus include all relevant mediating variables. In a cause and effect relationship, a mediating variable is a variable that links the independent and dependent variables, thus allowing the relationship between them to be better explained. To effectively test a cause and effect relationship between interest rates and gross investment. One also needs to include other variables that one might not be interested in measuring the effects of, but that could potentially impact gross investment. Such variables are called control variables, which are normally held constant, hypothetically speaking, not literal. Such variables may include economic growth, the savings rate, the balance of trade, long-term and short-term capital flows in an economy, the consumer price index, climatological factors, political factors, religious factors such as Islamic finance, for instance, and so on. So this first installment, I'm going to end it on mediating variables. In a cause and effect relationship, a mediating variable is a variable that links the independent and dependent variables, allowing the relationship between them to be better explained or better amplified. The conceptual model of a mediating variable is as follows. Ideally, we expect the independent variable, which is interest rates, to affect the dependent variable, which is gross investment. But the effect is usually disseminated via the consumer price index or the inflation rate, because the inflation rate tells us the cost of loanable funds in an economy. The impact may be diffused to the, in the loanable funds market where investment is mobilized through the consumer price index, which I'm giving here as a mediating variable. So I'm going to explain this further in the next installment or in the next video. Thank you so much for joining in. I will present the rest of this lecture in the evening. Have a nice day.